Welcome to another soothing journey into the depths of history and myth. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe you're lying in bed, maybe you're settling in on the couch, or maybe you've just put on your headphones to unwind. Wherever you are, let this story carry you into sleep and imagination. If you enjoy relaxing content like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep creating calm, thoughtful storytelling to help you drift off peacefully. Also, I'd love to know, comment below what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. Are you in London at 2 a.m. or in California as the sun is just setting? Let's see how far this story travels. The fires of Troy smouldered in the distance, painting the night sky with streaks of red and orange. The once proud city, a marvel of stone and bronze, lay in ruin. Toppled walls, shattered gates, and the ghosts of warriors drifting across the blood-soaked plains. 10 years it had taken the Greeks to break through those defenses. 10 years of siege, of heartbreak, of gods meddling in the affairs of mortals. 10 years of names like Achilles, Hector, Agamemnon, and Priam echoing in the war cries of men who would never return home. Odysseus, king of rocky Ithaca, stood aboard the deck of his ship, the salty wind tugging at his dark cloak. His eyes, sharp and contemplative, were not on the destruction behind him, but on the endless sea ahead. Though the Greeks had triumphed, there was no triumph in his heart. He had seen too much, lost too many. He thought of his comrades, brave warriors and loyal friends, who now lay buried beneath Troy's crumbled towers. He thought of Penelope, patient and faithful, waiting on the shores of Ithaca, of Telemachus, his only son, whom he had left as an infant, swaddled in the arms of a nurse. The thought of them, the scent of Penelope's hair, the tiny hand of his son wrapped around his finger, was a quiet ache that never left his chest. The fleet moved slowly across the Aegean, oars dipping rhythmically into the wine-dark sea. They had expected a swift return to greet their homelands with laurels and tales of valor. But the world had changed. The gods, once divided in their loyalties, were not so easily appeased. The war had angered many of them. Odysseus, clever though he was, had drawn the ire of one in particular, Poseidon, god of the sea, and so, as the ship carried him farther from Troy, it carried him also into the grasp of fate, a fate as winding and twisted as the seas themselves. Odysseus had always been a man of intellect, more than brute strength. He had spoken cautiously when others shouted, listened when others boasted. It was he who had counselled patience to Agamemnon, who had argued for diplomacy before war. And when war had come, it was he who devised the ruse of the wooden horse, a gift left at the gates of Troy, hollowed and filled with warriors, a deception so elegant that even the wisest Trojans could not resist it. He had known as the Greeks emerged from that wooden belly and opened Troy's gates from within, that such cunning would have a cost. The gods are not fond of mortal cleverness, especially not Poseidon, who favoured action and force over thought and subtlety. And so the sea god watched Odysseus' ship with an unforgiving gaze. The first weeks of travel were calm. The men, though wearied by war, found a strange peace in the rhythm of the sea. They sang songs of home and carved wood to pass the time. They told stories of heroes and monsters, of moments of bravery and foolishness alike. But the peace did not last. Their first misfortune came at Ismarus, city of the Cicones. Odysseus, ever the strategist, led his men in a swift raid. They took supplies, weapons, and treasure. But his men, drunk with victory and wine, refused to leave when he ordered it. The Cicones regrouped, bringing reinforcements. A battle erupted on the beach, and many of Odysseus's men fell. The survivors barely escaped, battered and bloodied. As they pushed back into the open sea, Odysseus felt the shift. The winds no longer favoured them. The skies darkened. Poseidon had begun his vengeance. For days the ships were tossed in tempests. Thunder cracked across the sky like the fury of Olympus itself. The men clung to ropes and oars, prayed to any god who might hear. Lightning tore through the sails. Rain fell like knives. And then, suddenly, silence. The storm passed, but they were lost. The stars, their guides, were hidden, and the currents had carried them far off course. It was then they came upon the land of the lotus eaters. The island was lush, its shores calm. Odysseus sent scouts to explore, and they did not return. When he went after them, he found them in a stupor, eyes glazed, smiling foolishly, chewing on the sweet fruit of the lotus. They had forgotten Ithaca, forgotten their names, their homes, their very purpose. Odysseus, horrified, dragged them back to the ships. He forced them aboard, tied them to the benches, and ordered the sails raised. He did not speak for hours. The sea, as treacherous as it was, at least had a destination. That island had offered only oblivion, and so they sailed on. The crew quieter now, sobered by the brush, with forgetfulness. They began to understand. This would not be a swift return. This was a journey that would test not only their strength, but their will, their memory, their very identity. Their next landfall brought them to a strange and rugged island, dotted with caves and rich with sheep and goats. Odysseus, curious as ever, led a small group inland, hoping to find food and hospitality. Instead, they found a cave stocked with cheeses and meat, and massive furniture carved from stone. They waited for the owner to return. They should not have. When the inhabitant returned, he was not a man, but a monster, a cyclops named Polyphemus. Towering and one-eyed, he was the son of Poseidon himself. At first, he seemed merely curious, then cruel, then murderous. He blocked the cave entrance with a massive stone and began eating the Greeks, 2 at a time. Odysseus, horrified but calculating, waited. He gave the Cyclops wine, enough to dull his senses. Then, while the creature slept, he drove a sharpened stake into its single eye. The Cyclops screamed. His roars shook the earth. But Odysseus and his men clung to the undersides of the sheep and escaped as they were let out to graze. They returned to their ship, wounded but alive. And Odysseus, proud in his cleverness, could not resist a final blow. As they pushed away from shore, he called out to the blinded beast, revealing his name. "Tell Poseidon it was Odysseus who tricked you." It was a mistake. Polyphemus, bellowing with rage and agony, called to his father. Poseidon heard, and from that moment on, the sea became Odysseus's enemy. After the escape from the land of the Cyclopes, Odysseus and his men drifted through the Aegean, guided not by certainty, but by desperation and the faint hope that home was still within reach. The sea was endless, a rippling sheet of unknowable intent beneath a sky that offered little guidance. Each dawn brought a different hue of uncertainty, and each night seemed darker than the last. But then, a glimmer of promise appeared on the horizon. They came upon the island of Aeolia, a place shrouded in myth and wind, ruled by Aeolus, keeper of the tempests and master of the skies. Unlike many who would cross Odysseus's path, Aeolus was hospitable. He feasted the travelers, listened to their tales, and saw in Odysseus a man marked by cunning and purpose. In a gesture of trust, Aeolus granted Odysseus a gift of immense power. A leather bag that contained every wind but one, the western breeze that would carry them home. All that was required was discipline, patience, and silence. Odysseus, understanding the preciousness of this gift, said nothing to his crew of its contents. For 9 days they sailed, Ithaca finally close enough to touch, the scent of olive groves and distant hills teasing their dreams. But as they neared the coast, exhaustion overcame Odysseus. He slept, and while he slept, curiosity, suspicion, and greed took root in the minds of his men. Believing the bag contained gold or spoils, they opened it. The winds exploded into fury. In an instant, the ships were wrenched from their course, hurled across the sea by gales of every direction. The vision of Ithaca vanished as quickly as it had appeared, like a dream disturbed. When Odysseus awoke, he said nothing for a long time. His fists were clenched, his jaw tight, but no words escaped him. What was there to say? Betrayed by his own crew, punished for his silence, and flung back into the grasp of Poseidon. The gods were laughing, he was sure of it. They returned, humiliated, to Aeolia, hoping for mercy. But Aeolus, now believing Odysseus cursed, refused to aid them again. "I will not risk the wrath of the gods," he said, turning them away. And so the ships sailed on, directionless and unblessed. The sea was a vast expanse of indifference, swallowing hope as easily as it did light. The men rowed in silence, hunger gnawing at their strength, salt clinging to their skin like a second layer. Days blurred into one another. The sun, once a symbol of life, had become a cruel overseer, scorching them from above as they drifted between unknown islands. Then came the land of the Laestrygonians, a place of towering cliffs and eerie stillness. Hoping for supplies, Odysseus sent a group inland to explore. They never returned. The people of that land were giants, monstrous and savage. One by one, they crushed the scouts, hurled boulders at the anchored ships, and devoured screaming men like animals. Only Odysseus's ship, anchored furthest from shore, escaped. As they rowed away, the sounds of destruction echoed behind them. Wood splintering, men crying out, bones breaking. Odysseus did not look back. He knew that if he did, the weight of what he had lost might break him. From 12 ships, only one remained. Eventually, the weary survivors reached an island cloaked in forest and mystery. This was Aeaea, home of Circe, the enchantress. Her palace lay hidden among dense woods, surrounded by tame wolves and lions who paced beside her gates, their eyes shining with unnatural intelligence. She welcomed Odysseus's men, offered them food and wine, and when they drank, she transformed them into swine with a flick of her wand and a whispered incantation. Only one escaped. Eurylochus, trembling with fear, ran back to the ship and warned Odysseus. Without hesitation, Odysseus went to confront her. On the path, he was met by Hermes, the messenger of the gods, who handed him a sprig of moly, a magical herb that would protect him from Circe's spells. Armed with this and his relentless resolve, Odysseus entered the palace. Circe, unaware of his resistance, offered him the enchanted cup. He drank, unaffected. When she raised her wand, he drew his sword. What followed was not a battle of blades, but of wills. Circe, astonished by his resistance, lowered her weapon and, over time, her defenses. She turned his men back into humans and offered hospitality instead of harm. For a year, Odysseus remained with her, a year that passed like a heartbeat and an eternity all at once. Her island was a place outside of time, warm, peaceful, seductive. And for a while, Odysseus let go. He laughed again, healed his wounds, tasted a life free of war and struggle. But dreams of Ithaca haunted his sleep. At last, when his longing grew unbearable, He approached Circe. He told her it was time to leave, and she did not try to stop him. Instead, she warned him, "Before you reach home, you must go down to the land of the dead," she said, "and seek the wisdom of the prophet Tiresias." Odysseus nodded. He had faced monsters and storms. He would now face the dead. To reach the underworld, they sailed to the edge of the known world, a land where the sun never shone and the waters turned black. There, following Circe's instructions, Odysseus dug a trench, poured libations, and sacrificed animals, calling to the spirits of the dead. The air grew cold. Shadows emerged, flickering at the edges of sight. And then they came, the souls of the departed, silent and hungry. He held them back with his sword, allowing only Tiresias to drink from the blood and speak. The prophet's voice was grave and slow, like stone cracking beneath pressure. "You seek home," he said, "but your path is cursed. Poseidon will not rest. When you come to the island of the sun, do not touch the sacred cattle, or your men will die. And even if you survive, your trials will not end at Ithaca. Trouble awaits you there as well." Other spirits came. His mother, Anticlea, who had died of grief in his absence. She wept when she saw him, and he reached out, only to grasp at air. Her voice broke him, more than any wound ever had. He saw fallen comrades, Achilles, still noble in death, who said he would rather be a living servant than a king among the dead. He saw Agamemnon, bitter from his murder at the hands of his wife. The underworld was not a place of peace. It was a whispering void of regret and memory. Odysseus left with a heavy heart. He had come seeking wisdom. He left knowing that the road ahead would be cruel. The return from the land of the dead was not a celebration, but a quiet, grim undertaking. The men, pale and silent, rode without speaking, the echoes of ghostly voices still clinging to the edges of their thoughts. Odysseus, heavy with knowledge and the weight of unfulfilled longing, stood at the prow and stared into the horizon. The words of Tiresias pulsed through him like a slow drumbeat, warnings of restraint, omens of doom, the certainty that even if he made it home, home would not be the sanctuary he remembered. He held this inside, close, saying nothing to his crew, not out of secrecy, but out of sorrow. There were burdens a leader must carry alone. They returned once more to Aeaea, where Circe awaited them. She welcomed them with an understanding gaze. She, too, had seen the shadows in his eyes. She bathed the men, fed them, gave them rest. Then she came to Odysseus and whispered again of what lay ahead. Before Ithaca, there are still many thresholds. You will sail past the sirens, whose voices are more dangerous than blades. You will pass through a narrow strait guarded by twin horrors, Scylla and Charybdis, and then the island of Helios. Remember the warning. Do not touch the cattle. Odysseus nodded, but said nothing. He had learned that the gods rarely made bargains. They issued tests, and those tests exacted a price. When they set sail, the air was still. The ocean lay flat and gleaming beneath the rising sun, almost too calm. It was the calm that comes before temptation, before madness. And then they heard it. Music. At first it was distant, a hum on the wind. But slowly it grew, becoming a song that seemed to reach inside their thoughts and awaken longings they had forgotten. This was the song of the sirens, not a melody, but a revelation, a voice that promised understanding, peace, and all the truths one yearns for in the darkest nights. Odysseus had prepared. Following Circe's advice, he had his men plug their ears with wax. Then he had them bind him to the mast, warning them not to release him no matter what he said. As the ship drifted past the Sirens' rocks, he heard them fully. They did not call to him with lies. They called with something worse. Truths. They sang of his fame, his pain, his search for home. They promised him clarity, an end to the journey, not through death, but through knowing. Odysseus screamed to be released. He cried out, begged, threatened. His body strained against the ropes, muscles tearing. But the men, deaf to his pleas, rode on. Only when the song faded and the rocks disappeared behind them did Odysseus fall limp, sweat-soaked and hoarse, hanging from the mast like a crucified dreamer. He would never forget that song. The sea narrowed into a strait. On one side towered a cliff, atop which dwelled Scylla, a creature of 12 legs and 6 ravenous heads, each with triple rows of teeth. On the other side, a whirlpool churned, Charybdis, a living maw that swallowed the sea and vomited it out in thunderous torrents. There was no safe passage. One could not avoid both. Odysseus chose Scylla, hoping that the cost would be fewer lives. He did not tell his men of the monster that awaited above. He did not want panic. As they passed the cliff, he prayed silently to every god he could name. And then, from above, it came. In a blur of motion and sound, Scylla descended. 6 of his men were lifted, screaming into the air, devoured before they could draw another breath. Odysseus, paralyzed with grief, watched helplessly. He had faced spears, storms, and the underworld. But this was something deeper. It was the knowledge that leadership sometimes meant choosing which of your men would die. They did not speak of it afterward. The sea moved on, as if nothing had happened. Exhausted and near collapse, they reached the island of Thrinacia, sacred to Helios, the sun god. It was a beautiful, fertile place. The cattle grazed peacefully under a cloudless sky. Odysseus, remembering Tiresias's words, warned his crew.
He made them swear not to touch the sacred animals. They agreed. They had no intention of angering another god. But as days passed, the winds turned against them, trapping the ship in the harbour. Supplies dwindled, hunger grew. For weeks they endured. Odysseus, straining against his hunger, went inland to pray and fast. While he was gone, the men broke. Temptation always arrives not as thunder, but as a whisper. They slaughtered the cattle and feasted. The moment the first drop of sacred blood touched the earth, the heavens stirred. When Odysseus returned, it was too late. Smoke from the fire curled into the sky, and his men lay sleeping, bellies full. The sun rose with unnatural heat, and as they set sail, the punishment came. A storm, sudden, merciless. Thunder shattered the sky. The ship splintered under divine fury. Lightning struck the mast. Waves rose like mountains. One by one, his men were dragged into the deep, their cries swallowed by the sea. Odysseus, alone, clung to the wreckage. For 9 days, he drifted. Eventually, he washed ashore on an island, Ogygia, a place both beautiful and cursed. There, he would remain, a prisoner of time, held in the arms of a goddess.
The island of Ogygia was unlike any Odysseus had seen. Lush beyond reason, it seemed untouched by the passage of time. Trees bore fruit out of season. Flowers bloomed in colours unseen elsewhere on earth. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms, the call of birds, and the sound of waves that crashed, not with fury but with rhythm, the lullaby of a world immune to suffering. Here, the seasons did not turn. The wind was always warm. The grass never browned. It was a place suspended in golden stillness. At the heart of this divine island lived Calypso, daughter of Atlas, a goddess of the sea and the stars. She found Odysseus, half drowned and unconscious on her shore, his hands bloodied, his body battered by Poseidon's wrath. She took him into her cave, nursed him back to health, and looked upon him not as a stranger, but as a gift the gods had sent her. He was mortal, but she loved him. Not with the fleeting lust of the sirens or the bewitching control of Circe, but with a soft, consuming devotion. She offered him more than healing. She offered him eternity. "If you stay," she said one evening, her voice no louder than the wind threading through the vines, "I will make you immortal. You will never age, never suffer. You will be a god beside me. No storms, no sorrow, no death." Odysseus listened, and for a long time he said nothing. He stayed on Ogygia for 7 years, and yet, though his body was safe, his soul remained adrift. He walked the island each morning, silent and alone, staring at the horizon as if willing Ithaca to rise from the waves. Calypso sang to him, lay beside him, kissed him with lips scented by the sea. But he did not smile, not truly. He was kind to her, but his heart was elsewhere, frozen in time, halfway across the world, perched on the balcony of his home, where Penelope might still be waiting. Each night, when Calypso slept, he wept, quietly, not like a warrior, but like a father who cannot remember his son's face, like a husband afraid he has been forgotten, like a man who has survived every test, only to realize that survival is not the same as return. The gods, watching from Olympus, took pity on him. Or perhaps they tired of the tale's stagnation. Zeus sent Hermes to Ogygia, and the winged messenger arrived in a shimmer of light. He told Calypso gently but firmly that Odysseus must be allowed to leave. The goddess raged, protested, wept. Why do you gods begrudge a goddess the love of a mortal man? She cried. But there was no appeal. The story was not hers to rewrite. She came to Odysseus, tearful but composed. "You are free to go," she said. "I will not stop you. I will help you. But know this, no one will ever love you as I have. And what waits for you out there is not peace." Odysseus met her gaze, eyes clouded with guilt and gratitude. "I know," he said, "but I must go." Together they built a raft. She gave him food, wine, and a gentle breeze. And as the island faded behind him, he felt both lighter and lonelier than he ever had before. The sea opened before him once more. The journey was not over. The gods still watched. And home was not yet won. The raft creaked beneath him, bound with ropes and sealed with pitch, a fragile vessel adrift upon the moods of the sea. Odysseus, bronzed by sun and scarred by time, clutched the tiller and squinted into the horizon. For 17 days, the sea remained merciful. The sun rose like a golden omen and fell like a tired promise. He rationed water, ate sparingly, watched seabirds trace wide circles above him like oracles. The wind, a steady hand upon his back, carried him westward, but he knew better than to trust in peace. He had angered a god who ruled the sea, and Poseidon had not yet delivered his final blow. On the 18th day, the sky darkened. A wall of cloud rose like a black citadel, swallowing the sun. The sea changed colour, no longer blue, but green and grey, like an old bruise. Wind shrieked from the east, and the waves became monstrous. Lightning forked above him, white as bone. The raft buckled beneath his weight, groaning as if alive. Poseidon, thundering from the depths, raised a hand, and the sea answered. Odysseus was flung into the deep. The raft shattered, oars spun away like leaves. He fought upward, lungs screaming, and broke the surface, only to be dragged down again. A god might swim without tiring. A mortal cannot. And yet he struggled, not for glory, not for defiance, but for home. Just as darkness claimed him, a figure emerged from the foam. Ino, the sea nymph, once a mortal queen, now a spirit of mercy. She cast him her veil, enchanted, weightless, and bade him let go of all else. Clinging to it, Odysseus floated for 2 days, tossed by waves and rain, drifting ever closer to land. At last, battered and half-conscious, he washed ashore on the island of Scheria, kingdom of the Phaeacians. The sand was soft and cold beneath him. He collapsed among reeds and slept as though dead. It was a young woman who found him, Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous. She had come to wash linens by the river, laughing with her handmaidens. But when she saw the haggard man, sea-salted and bearded, her laughter fell silent. He rose slowly, shielding himself, and spoke with the care of one who had learned to measure every word. His voice, hoarse but steady, moved her. She saw not a threat, but a man worn down by fate, yet unbroken. Nausicaa gave him clothing, food, and safe passage to the palace. There, among shining halls and polished bronze, Odysseus was bathed, fed, and honoured, though he kept his name hidden. At the banquet, as the bards sang of the Trojan war, of the wooden horse, of Achilles, of the fall of Troy, Odysseus wept. Not loudly, but enough for Alcinous to see that this stranger carried stories not yet spoken. The king pressed him gently. "Who are you, truly?" And so Odysseus revealed his name at last. He told them of Troy, of the Cicones, of the lotus eaters, and Polyphemus. He spoke of Aeolus and the bag of winds, of Laestrygonians and Circe, of the dead and the blind prophet, of sirens and sea beasts, of sacred cattle and a shattered crew. He spoke of Calypso and her quiet grief, of storms sent by a vengeful god, of a journey made not in days, but in sorrow. The Phaeacians listened in silence, then offered him what he had not dared to hope for, a final voyage. Their swift ship, carved of ivory and gold, carried him through the night. He lay wrapped in linens, asleep for the first time without fear. When dawn rose, Ithaca greeted him with mist, seagulls, and the scent of distant olives. He did not recognize it at first. Years had passed. His kingdom was changed. His beard was white at the edges. His limbs, once strong, moved more carefully now. But his heart beat faster as his feet touched its soil. At long last, home. Yet still, the journey was not over. Athena, always his unseen ally, disguised him as an old beggar. "You must test the ground you walk on," she said. "You must learn what waits before you reclaim what was lost." And so Odysseus, wrapped in rags, limped through the island of his birth unnoticed. He found loyal Eumaeus, his swineherd, who still spoke of his master with reverence. He learned of the suitors, arrogant, gluttonous men who had invaded his hall, pressed Penelope to choose a new husband, and devoured his wealth. His son, Telemachus, now a man, had searched the world for news, of his father. The two reunited in secret, tears held back by pride, and plotted the return. At last, the time came. Odysseus entered his palace disguised. None knew him. The suitors mocked him. Only Argos, his old dog, now near death, lying on a dung heap, recognized his master. At the sound of Odysseus's voice, the dog wagged his tail once, sighed, and died. That was loyalty. That was memory, refusing to fade. Penelope, still graceful, still grieving, spoke to the beggar and felt something stir within her. He knew things he should not. His words felt familiar, but she dared not hope. Hope had betrayed her before. She proposed a contest. Whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads would win her hand. One by one, the suitors tried. All failed. The bow was too strong. Then the beggar stepped forward. Laughter rang out, but Penelope said nothing. He took the bow in silence, tested the string, then notched an arrow. With a single motion, he pulled and fired. The arrow sang, a perfect line through the axe heads. And then all silence was broken. Odysseus revealed himself, and the slaughter began. Arrows flew, swords clashed, blood stained the stone. Justice, long delayed, fell swift and merciless. The suitors begged. Odysseus gave no quarter. When it was done, and the house quiet once more, he stood before Penelope. She stared at him, trembling. "If you are he," she whispered, "move our bed." He smiled. "That bed cannot be moved. I carved it from the living trunk of an olive tree. I built our house around it." And then she knew. Penelope fell into his arms, and time collapsed. The years, the war, the sea, all of it vanished in that embrace. There were no more disguises, no more trials, just Odysseus and Penelope, reunited at last, beneath a roof built of stone and memory, with a bed that no one could move. He had come home, not unchanged, not untouched, but home nonetheless. And that, at last, was enough. The palace stood in eerie silence after the suitors had fallen. The stone floors, once echoing with mockery and gluttony, were now marked with blood and memory. The household servants wept softly in corners. The maids who had been faithful were embraced. Those who had conspired with the invaders met justice in silence. Their fate handed down without fanfare. The old hall, once defiled, had been reclaimed, but not without cost. Odysseus moved through it slowly, barefoot, as though reacquainting himself with a place remembered only in dreams. He touched the pillars, ran his fingers along the wooden beams he had once carved with his own hands. Every inch of it was familiar, and yet changed, as he was. Beside him, Penelope walked not as a queen, but as a woman who had lived through her own Odyssey. Her trials had been quieter, more subtle, but no less harrowing. She had spent 20 years keeping wolves from the door, playing a game of deception, unraveling her weaving each night to buy time, protecting Telemachus, protecting hope. Now, she looked upon her husband not as the man who had left, young and full of swagger, but as the one who had endured, aged, weathered, scarred, and somehow more true for all of it. They sat together in silence for a long while, holding hands like strangers, learning each other again. Still, the journey demanded one final act. Odysseus, despite all he had overcome, could not simply resume his throne as if nothing had changed. Blood had been spilled, noble blood, despite its corruption, and the families of the suitors would soon come for retribution. Ithaca was a small island, and vengeance, once born, had a long memory. Athena appeared once more, her eyes flashing with divine stillness, and counseled him, act swiftly, act wisely, and above all, do not let the cycle of blood continue. And so, Odysseus left his halls at dawn and went to his father, Laertes, now a frail old man tending orchards on the edge of the kingdom, wearing rags and ash, thinking his son long dead. When Odysseus stood before him and spoke his name, Laertes at first did not believe. But when his son described the trees they had planted together, the rows of fig and olive, the slope of the land, details no impostor could know, the old king wept and embraced him. Together they stood against the families of the slain suitors who came with weapons and anger. Odysseus was ready to fight again, tired but unafraid. But Athena descended in brilliance, halting them all with a voice that silenced war. She declared peace, commanded forgetfulness, not as a suggestion, but as a divine decree. The island bent beneath her will. Swords were lowered, vengeance dissolved. At long last, the tale was done. Odysseus returned to his hearth. The fire burned low. The air smelled of ash and thyme, and the stars glimmered beyond the rafters. He lay beside Penelope, not a warrior, not a wanderer, not a king, but a man who had finally come home. Sleep took him gently, not like before when it came with dread and dreams of drowning, but like a blanket drawn over the weary shoulders of one who had finished his long night on the sea. And in the quiet heart of Ithaca, where olive trees whispered and the tides no longer pulled, the name Odysseus became not only legend, but peace. So it was that Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, once a warrior of endless battles and wanderer of distant seas, laid down his burdens. He was no longer the man who tricked the Trojans with a wooden horse, nor the man who clung to driftwood after Poseidon's fury shattered his ship. He was no longer the desperate voice crying out to the dead, nor the defiant soul resisting the song of sirens. He had returned, not unchanged, not unbroken, but whole in a new way, the kind of wholeness only suffering, survival, and love can shape. Ithaca had waited for him, yes, but more profoundly it had endured. The stones of his palace still stood, the olive trees still bent in the western wind. Penelope's loom still whispered the rhythm of patience. Telemachus, once an infant, now bore the quiet strength of a man shaped by absence. The island itself, with its cliffs and its goats, its caves and its silence, had remembered him even when his name faded from songs sung on the mainland. And what of Odysseus himself? What of the man who had seen the far corners of the known world, who had tasted immortality and turned away from it? The man who had defied gods, who had loved other women, yet dreamed only of one face. He did not boast of his trials. He did not seek glory. He sat in the quiet light of morning and listened to birdsong. He walked slowly through the orchards. He watched his son grow strong and wise. And some nights, as the fire crackled and the stars rose like scattered memories, he would smile without speaking, but he also remembered. There are things the sea leaves in a man, not on his skin, but in his thoughts. The smell of salt never truly leaves. The sound of waves returns in dreams. He remembered the names of every comrade lost.
He remembered the feel of rope burned into his wrists as he listened to the sirens sing. He remembered the lifeless eyes of the Cyclops, the trembling of his men in Circe's hall, the pleading voices of suitors before their final breath. He remembered, and he did not turn away from those memories. He did not let them poison his peace, but neither did he forget. Memory is a sacred weight.
Perhaps that is what it means to survive a great journey. Not to cast off all that was endured, but to carry it gently like stones in a satchel, reminders of who you became and why. Odysseus had learned that home is not a place without pain. It is not a place where time stands still. It is a place that forgives you, that takes you back, even when you are no longer who you were. And now, centuries later, you listen to his story, not just to hear of gods and monsters, but because some part of you too is seeking home. Maybe you don't sail oceans. Maybe your battles are quieter. Anxiety, memory, longing, change. Maybe your sirens sing through glowing screens and whispered doubt. Maybe your Scylla is the fear of losing control. Maybe your Charybdis is the whirlpool of uncertainty pulling at your thoughts. But still, you endure. You move forward, even when the path is hidden. You cling to hope, even when the sky darkens. You let go, when letting go is all that's left. You are Odysseus in your own way. The Odyssey is not only a story about a man returning home, it is a story about becoming, about reshaping, about living through what should have broken you and emerging not unchanged, but deeper, wiser, more human. It is the story of reaching the shore, finally, and recognizing that the greatest gift is not glory or recognition, but rest. And now your eyes grow heavy. The tide of thought is receding. The journey of this night, like the journey of our hero, is nearing its end. Let yourself drift. You have travelled far enough. The waves no longer rage. The winds are quiet. The stars are out, and they remember your name. The winds have gone silent now. The sails are furled. The oars rest against the hull. There is no need to fight the currents any longer. The battles have been fought. The monsters faced. The gods answered. Odysseus, whose name once echoed across the plains of Troy, now walks softly across the stone floors of his own home, as though afraid to wake a memory. But memories are not sleeping. They are very much awake, all of them. In the creak of a door, he hears the sigh of his ship's timbers. In the clink of pottery, he hears the sound of Circe's cups. In the far-off bark of a dog, he hears the echo of Argos's last breath. Each moment of peace is layered with the echo of a moment that came before, and so it is with life. The quiet we earn is shaped by the noise we endured. The palace is whole again. Repairs have been made. The blood has been washed away, but it is not forgotten. Penelope weaves again, this time not to stall a proposal, but to fill the silence with creation. Telemachus walks with new weight in his step, his shoulders held higher, his voice less uncertain. He is not a boy waiting for a father anymore. He is the son of Odysseus, and now the future king of Ithaca. Sometimes, in the softest hour of the evening, Odysseus stands on a balcony and watches the sea. It no longer threatens him. It no longer whispers promises or fears. It simply exists, rippling in slow breath. The sea taught him how to survive, but now the land teaches him how to stay. He thinks often of those he lost, Elpenor, who fell from Circe's roof, and Teclia, his mother, who waited too long, all the brave men who died on foreign shores or beneath monstrous jaws. They are not forgotten. He speaks their names sometimes when alone, not as prayer, but as honor. He knows he is alive because of choices he made and chances he did not deserve, and he does not squander that miracle. Even the gods are quiet now. Athena, who guided him in whispers and disguises, visits less often. Perhaps she trusts him to walk without her. Perhaps her part in the story is done. That is what. Stories do. They shift, fade, pass into new voices. Odysseus knows he is not the only wanderer. Somewhere, another journey begins. Somewhere, someone else wakes in a strange land, longing for a place called home. And maybe that someone is you. You've come far tonight. You've sailed alongside him through dream and memory. You've seen distant lands, faced fears, and listened deeply. Maybe not with your eyes open, maybe not with every word, but something in you has moved, a subtle tide. And that is enough. That is everything. Odysseus's physical return to Ithaca was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning of a complicated re-entry into a society that had learned to live without him. 20 years had passed. 2 decades of silence, rumors, lies, and adaptation. While Penelope had resisted the pressures of remarriage and Telemachus had grown from child to adult in his absence, the rest of Ithaca had not stood still. Land had changed hands. Loyalties had shifted. The palace, once the center of political and religious life on the island, had become a symbol of instability. Odysseus began his post-return reign under immediate pressure from within. The noble houses of Ithaca, small clans with limited wealth but considerable pride, had suffered tremendous losses. Their sons had joined the suitors, not out of love for Penelope, but out of a belief that the absence of the king signaled a new balance of power. With those sons now dead at Odysseus's hands, the island teetered on the edge of civil conflict. Odysseus understood military confrontation was no longer viable. He had returned with no army. The men who once followed him into battle were dead, buried at sea, lost to distant lands, or claimed by the gods. His political authority had to be re-established through governance, not force. In the weeks following the massacre of the suitors, he convened a council of elders, many of whom had assumed he was dead. They arrived reluctantly, suspicious of his authority and fearful of retribution. Odysseus offered no apologies, but he offered explanations. He laid out the entire chain of events: his delayed return, the actions of the suitors, the threats to his son's life, and the defense of his own property. He emphasized legal justifications rooted in Ithacan tradition and common Greek law. He pointed out that hospitality, or xenia, had been violated by the suitors first. He promised restitution where appropriate. Properties destroyed during the siege of the palace would be rebuilt at his expense. The temple of Apollo, which had been looted by the suitors, was rededicated with new offerings. He began a policy of economic revival. Fishing rights were expanded, port taxes were reduced, and seasonal food distribution was implemented using surplus from palace stores. Most crucially, he appointed Telemachus to oversee the management of these policies, not merely as an heir in waiting, but as a functioning regent. This was a calculated move. Telemachus had not been part of the war. He bore no blood on his hands. His youth, education, and political neutrality gave him credibility among younger nobles and foreign visitors. Slowly, resistance eroded. Externally, Odysseus re-engaged with neighboring kingdoms. Envoys were sent to Sparta, Mycenae, and Pylos. He offered alliances based not on old wartime friendships, but new economic incentives: grain, timber, and mutual naval support. In these letters and treaties, Odysseus positioned Ithaca not as a warrior state, but as a maritime hub. He proposed joint ventures, harbours for resupplying merchant fleets, pilotage for foreign vessels navigating Ionian waters, and long-term trading privileges. Ithaca's strategic location gave it leverage, even as its military strength waned. He also took a census, the first in Ithaca's memory. This allowed him to restructure taxation and military obligations fairly. Odysseus implemented a system of land-based levies, but with exemptions for fishermen and foreign traders. This turned economic stakeholders into allies, rather than potential rebels. Slowly, trust began to return. Order, though fragile, held. The spiritual element of his return was not ignored. Odysseus had spent years defying, pleading with, and surviving the will of gods. Now, as a ruler, he knew he had to publicly reconcile with divine authority. He restored the sanctuaries of Athena and Poseidon. For Poseidon, the god he had most angered, he commissioned a bronze trireme placed near the main port, a symbol of both tribute and humility. In a ceremony attended by all free citizens, he publicly acknowledged the damage done during his long journey and his intention to rule in accordance with divine law. But the prophecy from Tiresias still lingered. The oracle had made it clear. Odysseus's final task required him to journey inland, far from the sea, and make a symbolic offering where people knew nothing of oars, ships, or Poseidon's power. This was more than a religious task. It was a socio-political necessity, an end to the mythic narrative that had defined him for so long. Odysseus, always methodical, prepared the journey personally. He selected no royal retinue. He carried the oar alone, traveling anonymously through the interior of the Greek mainland. Weeks passed. He crossed rivers, climbed hills, passed through farming villages that had never heard his name. At last, an old man tending grain asked him what he carried. "A winnowing fan," he replied. The man accepted this without question. That was the sign. In that place, far from the sea, far from gods, far from identity, Odysseus performed the final sacrifice to Poseidon. A bull, a ram, and a boar. He poured libations. He asked for nothing. He simply fulfilled what was required. When he returned to Ithaca, he came not as a myth, not even as a king, but as a man who had completed his story. Following his final journey inland and the appeasement of Poseidon, Odysseus returned to Ithaca as a ruler no longer haunted by divine retribution. He re-entered his life not as a warrior seeking to control, but as a sovereign prepared to preserve. His role in governance shifted gradually. Recognizing that leadership had a generational arc, Odysseus turned his attention to ensuring continuity and stability for his people. His primary focus in these final years was succession. Though Telemachus had proven capable in matters of administration and diplomacy, Odysseus knew firsthand how easily power could splinter without legitimacy. To solidify the transition, he arranged a series of oaths with regional leaders and foreign allies, formally acknowledging Telemachus as heir. These were not merely political endorsements. They were inscribed onto stone and witnessed in public ceremonies. Ithaca would not suffer a disputed succession. Odysseus also initiated legal reforms. Drawing on what he had seen in other kingdoms, and perhaps influenced by his long exposure to varied customs abroad, he began codifying legal traditions that had previously been handled through oral precedent. He standardized marriage law, land inheritance practices, maritime trade regulations, and penalties for offences like theft or oath-breaking. This codification was inscribed onto stone tablets placed within the palace archive, Ithaca's first written civil code. This move reduced the power of informal kin-based justice and centralized legal authority in the monarchy and council. Economically, Odysseus invested in infrastructure. He oversaw the expansion of Ithaca's harbour facilities, turning the island into a modest yet stable maritime trade node. Warehouses were constructed to store olive oil, wine, and salted fish, goods that became export staples. He established annual festivals to promote unity among the populace, celebrating not only the gods, but shared cultural identity. These events helped redefine Ithacan patriotism, aligning it with peace, resilience, and law, rather than war and conquest. As the years passed, Odysseus began to withdraw from daily governance. Telemachus took over matters of court, agriculture, and trade. Penelope continued to act as diplomatic mediator and religious overseer. Odysseus's role became more symbolic. He attended festivals, issued judgments in complex land disputes, and remained a respected figurehead. He also dedicated more time to writing. While Homer's epics survive as oral tradition, later Greek sources imagined Odysseus recording his travels in logbooks, letters, or philosophical fragments, none of which survive, but which were said to inspire future Mediterranean navigators. His death, unlike most figures in Greek mythology, came quietly. There is no divine punishment, no final battle, no tragic twist. He died at home, surrounded by family. Most sources place his death in Ithaca. Others, especially later Roman authors, suggest he left on one final voyage and died abroad, perhaps in Italy. But the dominant tradition holds that he died an old man, peacefully, in the bed he once built with his own hands. That same bed, carved from the trunk of an olive tree, had been both literal and symbolic, immovable, rooted, enduring. It was the axis around which his entire life turned. After his death, Odysseus was deified in some local cults. Temples were erected in his honor in parts of western Greece and southern Italy. In these places, he was not worshipped as a warrior or king, but as a hero of intelligence and endurance. Shrines associated with his name attracted pilgrims, sailors seeking safe passage, scholars interested in his travels, and statesmen admiring his diplomacy. Culturally, Odysseus's legacy extended beyond Ithaca. The Homeric epics became central to Greek education. Students were taught not only the poetry of the Odyssey, but its moral lessons, the value of cleverness, the limits of pride, the dangers of temptation, and the need for persistence. Philosophers debated Odysseus's decisions. Plato criticized his cunning as dishonest. The Stoics praised his restraint. Later, Roman authors like Virgil paid homage through the character of Aeneas, who inherited many traits from Odysseus, but with Roman values attached: duty over desire, state over self. Odysseus became the prototype for a specific kind of leader, resourceful, emotionally complex, ethically ambiguous. Unlike Achilles or Hector, whose heroism was straightforward, Odysseus represented adaptability. He lied, deceived, delayed, and disguised, not because he lacked honor, but because his circumstances demanded it. He showed that survival sometimes requires compromise. His character became a lens through which readers across time could interpret politics, warfare, family, and fate. By the classical period, scholars had begun mapping his fictional journey onto real-world geography, identifying possible locations for the land of the Lotus Eaters, the Cyclopes, the Laestrygonians, and others. These interpretations helped reinforce Greek colonization efforts by providing mythological justification for expansion into Italy, Sicily, and North Africa. In the modern era, Odysseus's name has been invoked in literature, psychology, and even space exploration. His story endures not just because it is old, but because it is flexible. It evolves with each generation. It is not simply the story of one man's return. It is the human narrative of learning, failing, enduring, and understanding what matters most. The character of Odysseus, as preserved through the Odyssey and the Iliad, did not remain confined to Homeric poetry. Over time, his story evolved across mediums, from literature to visual art, philosophy to politics. Each culture that inherited the myth reshaped it to reflect its own values and fears. As such, Odysseus became more than a man or even a myth. He became a symbol, adaptable, universal, and multivalent. In early Greek art, Odysseus was often depicted in key scenes, blinding the Cyclops Polyphemus, clinging to the underside of sheep to escape, resisting the sirens, or returning in disguise to Ithaca. These visual representations emphasized his ingenuity, reinforcing his role not as a brute hero, but as a strategist. This intellectual form of heroism became increasingly important in later Greek thought, especially as the democratic polis began to value persuasive speech and political maneuvering over brute military might. Philosophically, Odysseus divided opinion. The sophists admired his rhetorical skills and use of deception, seeing in him a proto-orator. In contrast, Socratic and Platonic thinkers questioned his ethics, accusing him of manipulation and opportunism. Aristotle saw value in his prudence, while the Stoics admired his emotional endurance and ability to maintain inner control under extreme conditions. His choices, whether justified or not, became philosophical case studies, debated not just for their outcomes, but for what they revealed about human nature. During the Hellenistic period, Alexandrian scholars attempted to reconcile mythology with historical geography. They treated the Odyssey as both epic and encoded travelogue. Eratosthenes and Strabo analyzed Homer's text alongside known coastlines and attempted to match islands, straits, and capes with real-world locations. This pseudo-historical method gave rise to theories placing the Cyclopes in Sicily, Aeolus's island in the Lipari archipelago, and the land of the Phaeacians in Corfu. Roman writers took this further. The Augustan regime, in particular, admired Odysseus as a transitional figure, someone who embodied pietas, duty, but also dolus, strategic deception. While Virgil's Aeneid reconfigured Aeneas as the noble version of the returning hero, the shadow of Odysseus loomed large. Roman audiences understood that survival, especially imperial survival, sometimes required the same traits that defined Odysseus: calculation, manipulation, endurance. In post-classical interpretations, Odysseus's image fragmented. Christian medieval scholars often viewed him with suspicion. His deceit, adultery, and violence were incompatible with Christian virtue. Dante places Odysseus, Ulysses, in hell in the Inferno, condemned for his overreaching curiosity and reckless ambition. In this version, Odysseus does not return home at all. Instead, he sails beyond the Pillars of Hercules and perishes in a shipwreck, punished for seeking forbidden knowledge. This reimagining framed him not as a wise hero, but as a warning, a man who trespassed divine boundaries and paid the price. The Renaissance, however, brought rehabilitation. With the revival of classical texts and the rise of humanism, Odysseus was recast as a complex figure who embodied human potential and reason. Artists like Pinturicchio and literary figures like Tasso and Ariosto depicted him as a symbol of the intellect navigating the irrational world. He became an emblem of self-mastery, knowledge through suffering, and the ability to change course without surrendering to despair. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Odysseus was reinterpreted once again. Romantic poets saw in him the wanderer archetype, exiled, introspective, and doomed to motion. Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, Ulysses, portrays him as an aging hero, unwilling to fade quietly, yearning for one last voyage, one final push against fate. James Joyce's Ulysses, a modernist reimagining of the myth set in Dublin, stripped the story of gods and monsters, replacing them with the internal labyrinths of thought, language, and identity. In this version, Odysseus becomes Leopold Bloom, an everyman. His epic is one of surviving modern life, dislocation, and the struggle for meaning in the mundane. From a historical perspective, some scholars have attempted to locate a real Odysseus. Archaeological surveys of Ithaca and nearby islands have uncovered remains of Mycenaean-era structures, burial sites, and fortifications. While no definitive link to a historical Odysseus exists, these findings reinforce that the epic may be rooted in genuine Bronze Age displacement, a time when Greek leaders did return from long overseas campaigns to find their homes changed or threatened. Others argue that Odysseus is less a man and more a composite of migratory experience. His story mirrors the patterns of colonization and seafaring in the Mediterranean during the late 2nd millennium BCE. His path reflects ancient trade routes and contact zones. His trials, shipwrecks, foreign lands, hostile natives, echo the anxieties of navigating a dangerous, interconnected world. What has kept the story alive is not its literal truth, but its emotional precision. Odysseus is not remembered solely because he came home, but because of what he endured to get there. The monsters are metaphors, the storms are symbols, the gods, stand-ins for nature, fate, and the forces beyond comprehension. Every listener finds something different in the tale: loss, hope, betrayal, resilience, intellect, instinct, and still he speaks to us, not as a perfect man, but as a persistent one who failed often, succeeded narrowly, and chose return over comfort. That is his legacy, not just that he returned, but that the return meant something. The Odyssey, attributed to Homer, is not merely a tale of adventures and homecoming. It is one of the most structurally intricate and psychologically rich works of ancient literature. As a text, it demonstrates a sophisticated use of non-linear narrative, embedded storytelling, parallel characterization, and symbolic geography. As a character, Odysseus functions not only as a hero, but as a case study in human behavior. As we reach the final chapter of the Odyssey, what remains is not just a sequence of events, but a reflection on what it means to live, to struggle, and to return. Odysseus's journey was shaped by countless forces: divine will, human error, memory, loyalty, grief. Yet through all his trials, he endured. That endurance is not about perfection or constant strength, but about adapting, learning, and continuing when the path is unclear. The story closes not in triumph, but in equilibrium. Odysseus finds peace not by conquering new lands, but by restoring the one he nearly lost. His homecoming is less a final act than a restoration of balance, personal, political, and cosmic. The gods no longer intervene. Justice is served. The cycle of vengeance ends. More than a story about a hero, the Odyssey is a story about civilization, how we leave it, how we preserve it, and how we must sometimes rebuild it. The sea represents chaos, the shore, order. Odysseus travels both realms. He is the rare figure who belongs to war and peace, past and future, myth and memory. And so, the epic concludes not with battle, but with stability. Odysseus sits beside Penelope. The oar is laid down. The storm has passed. What remains is the journey and what it taught us about ourselves. With the tale of Odysseus reaching its final note, we're left not with the rush of battle or the roar of gods, but with the quiet aftermath, the reassembly of a life. The Odyssey ends not in the way of a traditional epic, but with reconciliation. It is a story not about conquest, but about restoration. Odysseus doesn't ascend to a throne of new power. He reclaims what was always his. He doesn't become someone else. He becomes himself again. This return is not just physical. It is emotional, psychological, and symbolic. Throughout the epic, Odysseus is tested on every level, physically through survival, intellectually through deception, emotionally through loss and temptation, and spiritually through humility. His journey is one of stripping away illusion, of discovering what truly matters when everything else has been taken. The narrative ends in a state of balance. The suitors are dead. The kingdom is restabilized. Penelope is restored to her rightful place. Telemachus has emerged as a leader. The gods withdraw. The journey, which once sprawled across oceans and foreign lands, contracts into the small, hard-earned peace of home. The tension of the epic dissolves into stillness. But the legacy of the Odyssey does not end with its plot. It survives because it reveals something essential about human nature. Our desire to find meaning through movement, our need to return to where we started and see it with new eyes. In this sense, every person is Odysseus in some way. We are all shaped by our journeys, long or short, literal or internal. We all navigate between who we are, who we were, and who we might become. Literarily, the epic established narrative norms that persist in global storytelling. The concept of the hero's journey, departure, initiation, return, forms the spine of countless novels, films, and myths. But the Odyssey is not formulaic. It resists simplicity. Its protagonist is flawed. He lies, kills, strays, hesitates. He is not always admirable, yet always human. That complexity is what has kept the story alive. In academia, the Odyssey continues to be a source of inquiry across disciplines. Historians examine its depiction of Bronze Age society. Linguists study Homeric Greek for its evolution and dialects. Psychologists analyze Odysseus's trauma and coping mechanisms. Anthropologists explore the rituals and customs embedded in the poem. Political theorists interpret the return to Ithaca as a meditation on the fragility and recovery of state power. And in modern life, the Odyssey persists as metaphor. Refugees cross seas for uncertain safety. Soldiers return from war to find the world they left has changed. Individuals wrestle with identity, reinvention, and longing. Home, like Ithaca, is no longer a location. It becomes a concept, something internal, remembered, reconstructed. That is why the story endures. Because Odysseus is not only a character in ancient myth, but a pattern we recognize in ourselves. His wanderings reflect our disorientation. His resistance mirrors our stubbornness. His homecoming symbolizes our hope, the hope that even after loss, transformation, and time, something remains worth returning to. So the story concludes, not with the final battle, but with the soft return to form, a home rebuilt, a name restored, a journey complete. And now the epic becomes quiet, not because it has ended, but because it has entered us.